Anyways, now for today's guest or speaker, Dr. Devin Naar is the Isaac Al-Khadef Professor in Sephardic Studies, Associate Professor of History, and faculty at the Strum Center for Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. That's a pretty nice title, I have to say. Where he also serves as the chair of the Sephardic Studies program. Dr. Naar is an expert on Sephardic and Ottoman Jews. His first and awards with an S at the end, winning book, Jewish Salonika Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, was published in 2016 by Stanford University Press. In the Sephardic Studies Center, Dr. Naar has created the first major online Sephardic Studies digital library and archive, comprising of over 1,500 artifacts. For the last 2 years, Dr. Naar served as the co-chair of the Sephardic Studies Division at the Association for Jewish Studies. That's a position that I'm very proud to succeed him in alongside my colleague, Dr. Devin Naar of the University of Michigan. Dr. Naar is also responsible, perhaps without knowing, for inspiring the introduction to my upcoming book on Ottoman Jews because of the attention he drew to how the field of Jewish studies has treated Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, I admit, for much earlier than I thought back then, but since then I've learned quite a bit. So it's really my great pleasure to have Dr. Naar with us today, and hopefully we will be able to host him here in Charleston in person at some point, not very far into the future. It's also not very often that one gets to converse in a public event with a fellow Ottoman Jewish historian, because there are just really not very many of us in the world. But today is such an occasion. So Devin, welcome. And it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Yaron. It's really a pleasure. And it's great to be here virtually. I do wish I could have been there in person, but hopefully in the future, I do have a South Carolina, contingent of relatives. And I see some of them there and also some other relatives too. So that's very nice. And some friends. So it's wonderful to see some familiar faces and some many new ones. And thank you and Kim for this opportunity.
Thank you. Well, I think we can jump right into our conversation. We just said before we let everyone into the room that we don't have too many questions to discuss, but Devin and I could probably spend the whole day discussing them. But we don't have a whole day. We only have about an hour. So let's see what we can do. So I think many people in our audience are familiar with, or have heard at least, of the mistreatment of Mizrahi or Arab Jews in Israel in the 1950s. And for those who are not, I'll just briefly say that when non-European Jews or Jews from non-European countries, mostly from Arab countries, arrived in Israel, in the new state of Israel in the early 1950s, they were subject to racism and harassment and derogatory terms that were invented and used to describe them. And for many years, they had no share in the social and political dominant class, even though they were in fact the majority of Israelis. So many people know one or another version of this story. And I think where I want to start is that just it? Or are there or were there parallels to this phenomenon here in the US, meaning that Jews from certain background were treated negatively by Jews from other backgrounds?
It's a great question, and it's a really big question, Yaron, because I think if you delve into the history, the story of, unfortunately, first of all, I would say it's a difficult story to confront and to try to deal with, to think about intra-Jewish prejudices. Because I think there's a conception that we maybe have or would like to have that Jews are united or should be united, that there are so many external pressures. Anti-Semitism has been such a strong force in Jewish history. Why create animosity and divisions and hierarchies among other Jews? Unfortunately, I think it's precisely because of the vulnerable position that Jews have found themselves in, including in the United States, that has contributed to the creation and reinforcing of these kinds of divisions and hierarchies. And that's true in the United States. So maybe I could answer this question in two ways, which is to first give you a little snapshot of what the position of Jews in general was like in the United States like 100 years ago, and to show how that position is actually shapes and dictates the way in which, let's say, European Jews wound up treating Jews coming from other parts of the world into the United States, in the beginning of the 20th century, which is like when my family came. I mean, I'm Sephardic and Ashkenazic, so I have both of these stories. Yeah, I think many of us are, insofar as, they're woven together in my own family story. And so that makes it both very interesting, very pressing, and also difficult. So like if you go back, to the beginning of American history, really in the, with the foundation of the country, we can go all the way back to that point. And maybe I'll share, I have a couple of images that I think I could share with you that might help here. Yes. Yeah. So if you look at this here, this is the first act of Congress, and it talks about what they decide is who can become an American citizen. Okay. What are the criteria according to which, if you're born somewhere else, which most of the founders of the country were, what qualifies you to become an American citizen? And essentially the only thing that the founders agreed upon as a prerequisite to become a citizen of the United States was that you had to be a free white person. Okay? Nobody likes to talk about this because it's very uncomfortable, but this is when we talk about institutional racism, we talk about structural racism, the way in which racist practices are built into the very fabric of our society. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So from the very beginning of the founding of the country, if you wanted to come to this country and you wanted to participate and have the rights and opportunities that are afforded by this country through citizenship, you had to show and prove that you were a white person. And basically, what does it mean to be a white person? Well, turns out not so clear. And so what winds up happening, especially in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, because after the Civil War, eventually the U.S. Government would say that you could also be of African nativity or African descent to become a citizen. And if you're not black and if you're not white, can you become a citizen of this country? And that's where the Jewish picture, the story begins to develop, because in the imagination of the American public in the 19th century, not exactly clear even where European Jews fit in this racial kind of hierarchy, because at the time it was not only about color, the color of your skin or how you look, it was also about what was thought about you based on your culture, your language, where you were from. By the beginning of the 20th century, ideas of race science, of eugenics, of social Darwinism were pervasive in American society and shaping every aspect of public policy, immigration and healthcare laws, housing, finance. Everything was shaped by race science, so much so that especially when it came to immigration, the US government began to classify immigrants. Who was more desirable and who was less desirable was based on one's race. The idea is what you could achieve in life in a racist framework, in a race science framework that was ubiquitous 100 years ago, was not necessarily based on anything that you yourself did or did not do, but what you could or could not do, the belief was already pre-programmed into you by virtue of your birth, of your descent, of your genealogy. And, even though we don't speak in such explicitly racist language today, or at least it's not, well, okay, it's less politically correct now, that logic is still with us. Because you don't really have to think about it to be familiar with the race hierarchy that is presented in this chart that was certified by Congress 110 years ago about which immigrants are most desirable and which immigrants are least desirable. It will almost be obvious in some ways that Scandinavian and Western European people will be at the top, and that Black people and Indigenous people will be at the bottom. Now, for our purposes, and this is very disturbing, I hope you're disturbed by this, but this is a formal U.S. government document that was commissioned by Congress and endorsed by the Teddy Roosevelt administration. with experts and the whole works. It was a major enterprise. They wrote 40 volumes about immigrants in America, and this is what they came up with based on their empirical evidence about who is a more desirable immigrant and who is less desirable. And what's also interesting for our purposes is look how far at the bottom Hebrews are. And that's something for us to really pay attention to, which is that in this era, Jews, no matter what you look like a white person, you look like a brown person, you are a black person. Jews come in all different varieties and all different backgrounds. Jews were identified as a distinct race at the time. In the United States, in Europe, this is most insidious and most provocatively remembered, of course, in the German context, but Nazi Germany was not alone in thinking about Jews as a distinct race. Jews were considered part of the Hebrew race. They were considered part of the Semitic racial group along with Arabs. So they're right here at the very bottom of what is the Caucasian bracket here, of the white bracket in this Semitic group. And they share this status at the very bottom. They're sort of wavering, teetering between white and not white. And so Jews, European Jews, Jews of German origin, Jews of Eastern European origin, who will be the vast majority of Jews in this country, will try to work very hard to ensure that the US government, that the state, and that their neighbors see them as white, if they can be seen as white. So that means doing things like assimilate, which actually means adopting whiteness as your worldview and as your framework. Let's adopt names that make us identified on pieces of paper like white people. Let's make us abandon our languages so we can operate as best as we can as white people. Let's live with white people in the hopes that we will gain the protections of white people. Because the reality was that Jews were really on this kind of borderline zone. So how does that relate to the specific experiences of Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire, of Jews coming from the Muslim world, of Jews coming from the world that is not Europe, the world that is not represented at the top of this racial hierarchy? Well, what happens there is that really around the time of World War I, many Jews start to come from the Muslim world, from the Ottoman Empire, from what is today Turkey and Greece, some Egypt, Bulgaria, what is now Israel, Palestine, that broader world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Many Jews start to come to this country, and they are now confronted with this racial hierarchical system. Where are they? Are they considered Jews? Are they considered Hebrews? Are they considered something else? And it became a problem not only for the government officials who didn't really know what to do with Jews who didn't speak Yiddish and who had names like Ayalon or Naar or whatever kinds of names that are not Goldstein and whatever, these typical kinds of Jewish sounding, in the American imagination, Jewish sounding names. They spoke different languages. They also, some of them looked different. Some of them were, in fact, darker complected. They had different kinds of foods. They had different pronunciation of Hebrew. They had different customs, different observances. There was literal difference there. But how did that translate into where they sat in the American racial hierarchy and where they sat in the eyes of what we might call the mainstream American Jewish community? And if I could just give you one or two examples here, I think that will hopefully illustrate the beginnings of how this kind of tension develops. And a lot of it has to do not only with the sense that Sephardic Jews, as they're oftentimes called now, or Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean, Jews from the Muslim world, are different from European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews, but that they were also a liability to the status and reputation of the mainstream white-ish, white enough Jewish community. So we see this in terms of how the organized Jewish community responds to the arrival of new Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean. The major Jewish organizations on the East Coast hold a specific conference in 1913 during the Balkan Wars, just before World War I, to figure out what to do with the Oriental problem. And that's what they call it. They referred to the Jews coming from the Muslim world as Orientals and as Asiatics. And they say, how are we going to deal with these people who are so different from us? And I brought you a little snippet here of how some of the participants spoke at the time. the members of this conference emphasized the psychic and psychological difference between the Levantine Jew. The Levant is also another name for the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern region. And see what's happening here in the language? There are our Russian, Austrian, and Romanian co-religionists, meaning our European origin co-religionists, meaning our white co-religionists, our American co-religionists who belong in America. And then there are them, these newcomers. So great is the difference that there seems to be little in common. The points of similarity are few. Now look at this. The Levantine Jew is as human, or almost as human, as any other. This is dehumanizing language. It is an internalization and refraction and projection of that very same racial hierarchy that we were seeing playing out in American society more generally. And we can see even other people observe it. You know, there are many stories when some of the first Jews from the Ottoman Empire come to the United States and they try to go, they figure who's going to help them out? Other Jews. So they go to the Lower East Side, and there's a famous case of a gentleman by the name of Alberto Amato, his family was from a town now near Izmir in Turkey. He was a well-educated guy. He was a lawyer. He spoke 7 or 8 languages. Just so happens that Yiddish was not one of them. And he goes to the Lower East Side, and he's looking for an apartment. And he goes and starts to try to get some interviews. And he goes around, and one of the prospective landlords says, Alberto Amato, that's not a Jewish name. Are you Jewish? He says, yes, I'm Jewish. He says, well, do you speak Yiddish? He says, no, I don't speak Yiddish. He says, well, how can you be Jewish if you don't speak Yiddish and you have a name like Alberto Amato? And the Ashkenazi prospective landlord says, there's only one way to find out if you're Jewish. And he makes him pull down his pants. And he pulls down his pants, and he sees that Amato is circumcised. And what does this guy do? He says, you must be a Muslim. Get out of here. And this symbolizes, in some ways, the intensity of the initial tension between the two kinds of groups, that outsiders even observe this. Sociologists here, Levantine Jews feel more discrimination from the other wings of the Jews than they do from the non-Jews. And this kind of intensity and discrimination is codified, and I'll just give you one last example, is codified in the 1920s. I'm gonna go get out of here first, go back to just the screen for a second, in which basically you have the Jewish Federation of New York, okay, major institution, commissions a study in the 1920s about the Turkish Jews in the United States. So if you were from Greece, or you were from Turkey, or you're from North Africa, or you were the Oriental Jews, Levantine Jews, Turkish Jews, these were terms that were all sort of used in common at this time. And what you wind up seeing happen is this scholar at Columbia University writes a study about the Sephardic Jews in the United States, and he absorbs and replicates all of the same kind of racialized language in a very disturbing way, codifies it in a formal study. Now, you're in Charleston, which is the South, and I would like to know what you think of the opening line of this guy's study about Sephardic Jews in America in 1926. He begins his study by saying, this is the first line, Sephardic Jews are as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen as are the Negroes to the average white Southerner. I would like to say that again, because I want that to sit in for a second. Sephardic Jews are as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen, and pardon the language, this is the language of the time, as the Negroes, as are the Negroes to the average white Southerner. What does this say? They could not be further apart from each other. They have nothing to do with each other. This is a world in which blacks and whites could not live together. They could not marry together. They could not do so many different things. And this is an academic at Columbia University who is commissioned by a major institution in the American Jewish community, the New York Federation, to study and using reason and science and research to determine the status of these newcomers from the former Ottoman Empire. And he went on to argue what is the problem in his view, in his scientific view, with Jews from the former Ottoman Empire, from Greece and Turkey. That was what he was specifically talking about. He was talking about people that look like me and you, Yaron. I mean, some of them were darker complected, some of them were lighter complected, but really it's about race science, not necessarily only about appearance. He says, what is the problem? And this is the language of the time. It's very disturbing. The problem with Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean is that they have absorbed the racial characteristics of their neighbors. They have become like Black people. They have become, because they're close to Africa, they have become like Arabs because they're close to Arabs. They have become like Muslims because they come from the Muslim world. None of those terms were intended to be compliments. None of those terms were intended to be compliments. They are a reflection of America's own racial hierarchy. And he gets into the science of it. He has a whole theory about why Sephardic men can't keep a job, which is not true, but this is what he says. Sephardic men can't keep a job because their women cook vegetarian food for them. And it doesn't make them strong enough to maintain a job. I mean, this is science. This is 1926 science. Right now, we know the Mediterranean diet is perhaps the best diet. But at the time, if you're not eating steak and potatoes or something, something's got to be wrong with you. So it's under the guise of science, but this reveals it's BS, right? And what is his final? And this is the final remark I'll offer on this on this opening question here. I took it many different ways here. I hope you don't mind, but just to sort of show the intellectual foundation of this problem is set in the beginning of the 20th century. So he's writing a policy paper, this scholar at Columbia University for the Jewish Federation, because the Jewish Federation wants to know, what do we do with these people who are so different from us? They live in other places from us. They speak a different language. And what does he say? He says, one hope might be, and I'm paraphrasing, is if we get the Sephardic Jews to intermarry with us, the Ashkenazi Jews, we might be able to civilize them. And in a few generations, the racial stain that has been left by their African and Arab context may be able to be bred out of them, so that by then, in some generations, they will become suitable for participation in white American society. He says the likelihood of that is slim in 1926, and he said the best solution would be to let them remain on their own, and because they are so weak in nature, they will eventually disappear.
Well, I haven't disappeared yet. And on the contrary, this is all fascinating stuff. But before I get to my next question, a few comments. First of all, I think the irony wasn't lost on this person you quoted, or was lost, in fact, on the person you quoted who said about those Jews that they adopted the customs of Muslims and those living around them back in the Middle East. Of course, if you adopt that culture, that undermines the entire racial theory, right? Because if you're racist, then that's who you are. There's nothing else that can be done. But we all know that contradictions, that's part of any racist theory that ever existed. There have to be these internal contradictions, and people don't mind them. It's part of how it goes. For your question about Charleston, I would say, look, many Jews here were whites. Now, I'm not, we have other people here on this call who are more expert on Charleston Jews than I am, but they were in many ways considered white, including in the sense of owning slaves. And so, of course, if you are in that category, then why would you think anything much better about Jews from the Muslim world? I mean, it seems pretty natural in that sense. So, in fact, that researcher from the Jewish Federation he didn't put it this way, but he may not have been so wrong about characterizing Jews in the United States as how far they are from Middle Eastern Jews, meaning that some of them probably saw it that way as well. And we know that whiteness is a thing that evolved, right? It's like a ladder. You find a group that can take your place. You go up one stage up in the ladder of becoming more white because there's another group underneath you that, I mean, this happened not just in the Jewish world, right? It happened with Italians and the Irish and Jews too. So you climb it up, and the way to climb it is, of course, to find those other people. But it's not very cool, right, to say those things, to be outright expressing those racist ideas anymore. But there are remnants of this that we see today. Well, maybe we can talk about this a little later. There are some remnants that we can see to this. Maybe they're not all, outright racist, but I'm sure this happened to you many times. It happened to me lots of times in my life in the US when interacting with American Jews, especially more in the New York area than other places. And one of the first questions I get is either if I speak Yiddish, or they'll just say something in Yiddish and they assume that I understand it. And when I say I don't speak Yiddish, they may not say, what kind of a Jew are you? Although some have said that to me as well, but maybe they'll just look puzzled. How is it? And my response, and I've actually said it because some of you who know me know that sometimes I say what I think. So I'll look back at them and I'll say, well, do you speak Arabic? And they would say no, sometimes with disgust, of course. And I'll say, you do know that, in fact, Arabic was just as much of a Jewish language as Yiddish was, right? And then that usually is the end of the conversation. So I'm just saying those things still exist. Or even, minor assumptions that certain things are part of the Jewish existence or Jewish culture, but they're really part of Ashkenazi, North American, or European Jewish culture, but they're not part of universal Jewish culture. So anyways, I just think we're not done with this yet. But in fact, my next question actually goes a little back because you talked about the early 20th century, and my response was about the late 20th or the early 21st. But how far back do we see those negative attitudes? And specifically, negative attitudes of Ashkenazi Jews, whether North American or European, toward Sephardic Jews, or I wouldn't call them Mizrahi Jews, that's a newer term, but Sephardic Jews or Jews of the East in general. How far back do we trace those negative attitudes? What have you seen? How far back can we take this?
There are a lot of intra-Jewish tensions is as old as Jewish history. So we're not going to recount all of it for you. But I would say this particular question that you're looking at has to do, in fact, with some ways the way in which general European society is organized. And, in many ways, like in the Middle Ages, European society was organized not on an East-West framework necessarily, but in some ways on a North-South kind of division. Where you really see the East-West divide intensifying is in the era of the Enlightenment, which also is in the 17th and really 18th century, where you see also the beginnings of racial understandings of the world. One of the figures that I like to mention in this context is Kant, the famous German philosopher, the main figure of one of the main figures of the European Enlightenment. And he was one of also the world's first racial thinkers, and he sort of organized societies in his work from west to east. The closest you were to Protestantism and whiteness, the closest you were to fulfilling your potential as a human being. The further away you get from that, the less human you were. What he said is that Jews are somewhere in between in the 18th century. Jews are somewhere in between whites and blacks. But the problem he saw with Jews is that they're actually inside of Europe. And therefore, they're a greater threat than, say, blacks or Arabs or Asians, because they actually live among us. So do you know what Kant's solution to the problem of having Jews in Europe was? This he wrote, the great philosopher Kant. He said, the euthanasia of Judaism. He said that Jews should erase their Judaism in order to save their humanity. So he thought that Jews could be redeemed if they just stopped being Jewish. It's kind of like, if you think of the American context, the slogan of kill the Indian to save the man. I don't know if you're familiar with that from the early 20th century. Same kind of colonial attitude. In this case, the only way forward for Jews to participate in American society, in European society at the time, was if they did their damnedest to make themselves as close to white, especially Protestant Europeans, as possible. And this leads to all of the pressures of assimilation that we're familiar with today. And we see that because the argument was like, it's okay to be different. Nobody said that. Nobody made that argument. Nobody made that argument. Nobody made the argument that it's okay to be different. And so Jews, in a position where they didn't have power, they didn't have citizenship and rights in many countries in Europe in the 19th century, they had to try to figure out, how are they going to survive in this place? And some of the intellectuals begin to develop narratives about how Jews belong in Europe. And one of those figures was a very famous 19th century German historian called Heinrich Gretz. And Gretz is one of the first guys who writes a major Jewish history, like from the beginning until the end. I mean, in the 19th century.
Yes.
No, sorry, go ahead, Yaron.
No, his end. I'm saying until his life, more or less.
Until the like mid-late 19th century. And it became the most famous Jewish history really ever written in the world. It was translated into many languages. We even had, my grandfather had a set of this history that I didn't really look at when I was a kid, but I mean, eventually I found out that he had it. But in this history, what's really interesting is he sets up two ideas of the Sephardic Jew in there, which is, on the one hand, he sets up the Sephardic Jew, and this is where it gets really interesting. For him, the medieval Spanish Jew becomes the ideal Jew, the model Jew that the 19th century European Jews should emulate. Why? Because he thought of the great figures of the Spanish Jewish Golden Age as the greatest manifestation of Jewish identity that was combined with also Jewish participation in general society. So you have Maimonides, who's a philosopher and a doctor, but he's also embedded in his general society. And this was the idea of the grandeur of medieval Jewish Spain, being Jewish, but also fully integrated into your surrounding, into your society, speaking the language of your neighbors, suitable for participation in government, which was the case in medieval Spain. Now, the one part that is not mentioned is that all of this is happening when Spain is under Muslim control. And when Spain goes into Christian control during the Reconquest, Jews lose a lot of those opportunities and privileges, and eventually they're expelled. But let's just bracket that for a moment. So that's why you see in 19th century Germany, you see Jews, Reformed Jews, who are trying to assimilate, building synagogues that look like mosques. They build them with arabesque architecture and arches, Moorish architecture. They're trying to integrate by drawing on this model of medieval Spain. Okay, so there's one piece. Now, what happens to the Sephardic Jews after they're expelled from Spain in Gretz's narrative? And this is, again, the mid-19th century. Well, they are expelled from Spain in 1492, and they disperse across the Mediterranean, and many find refuge in the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, he draws on the tropes of the time. He draws on the logic that was available since Kant, a century before almost, to say, look, the East is benighted. The East is backwards. The East is uncivilized. The East is barbaric. And the Jews who entered that domain absorbed the characteristics of their surroundings. So while the ancestors of the Sephardic Jews were the greatest Jews of all time, he says essentially, their descendants, he stops calling Sephardic Jews, by the way, and he calls them Turkish Jews. And he writes that, and this is a quote, Turkish Jews did not produce a single great genius who originated ideas to stimulate future ages, nor mark out a new thought for men of average intelligence. Not one of their leaders was above the level of mediocrity. their Spanish glory was extinguished like a meteor and plunged into utter darkness, because they had been absorbed in his logic into what he perceived in his Orientalist, racist imagination that was not special to him, typical of European society at the time. They'd been absorbed by their Muslim, Middle Eastern environment. And not only that, you know what happens? They disappear from his story. So Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire do not appear in this universal Jewish history after essentially Shabbatai Tzvi, after the 17th century. They we don't need to bracket that. I don't want to get too much into that, but basically they disappear, not to be heard from for 200 or 300 years. They are literally, because they are not useful for his project. His project is to write a history to show that Jews belong in Europe, to show that there are Jews in Muslim societies today does not help him show that Jews should be considered European people on a par with Christians, eligible and worthy of the rights and protections of citizenship in the countries in which they live. And in some ways, that legacy of the writing out of the Jews from the Muslim world, which is already at play in the middle of the 19th century, this is what you're alluding to, I think, Yaron, that is still with us today in a very profound way.
Yes, thank you, and I'm alluding to that, but I think there's a somewhat of a longer story here, because Gretz begins in many ways. He's considered one of those founders of this new field that you and I and many others on this call are a part of today, of Jewish studies, right? And he says, you quoted one, and I want to add another quote, because there are really some great gems from Gretz about this. Wonderful things. Mine is, I was hoping, I didn't know if you would get to that, but the one I had was when he says, the fact that Jews occupied an exceedingly favored position in Turkey for so long a period did not result in correspondingly enduring progress. They did not produce a single great genius who originated ideas to stimulate future ages. Oh, that part you did say. But the thing is that then he goes on and he says, only one rabbi left to posterity, an epoch-making work, which even yet possesses significance, disputed though it be, but even this work contained nothing new or original. And this, he talked about Joseph Caro, of course, and the Shulchan Aruch. And that's the work that completely revolutionized Orthodoxy, or created it. So the guy really had his biases, that's pretty clear. The issue is that even if you move forward in time and look at other scholars, like Salo Baron, for instance, who wrote 18 volumes of Jewish history, right? But Ottoman Jews are only in volume 18. That's the end. So they're sort of relegated to the end of the story. And you can think of Jacob Katz, for instance, who wrote a great history of Jews. When do Ottoman Jews appear in his story? Of course, in a negative way. When we talk about Shabtai Tzvi and how devastating that movement was for the Jewish world. And so I think, and in many ways that continued, and we see parts of it today, right? I mean, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, that the remnants of this, even if today most people who deal with Jewish studies don't particularly have any animosity towards Sephardic Jews or studying Sephardic Jews, even if they don't do it themselves, the remnants of it is that the number of people and the size of this particular subfield, as you and I know very well, is very, very small compared to how many Sephardic Jews were and still are in the world, and their contribution to Jewish history. Most of Jewish law as we have it today was written by Sephardic Jews. Yet we are what? You may have better numbers than I have. 10% of the Association for Jewish Studies papers every year? Maybe we're 10%. I don't even know. You're muted, so we can't hear you.
Way less.
Less than 10%, right? Yeah. So, I mean, some of those things are just, I guess they're still around. And I don't know what is this? This is not just an academic thing, right? I mean, we see it also there's some links there or some parallels, maybe not links, but parallels between what we see in the Jewish community and what we see in the academic world. And I guess part of me wonders if you think we can talk about progress, if there has been progress. I feel I've seen some in the decade plus that I've been involved in our group at AJS, and perhaps you have too, but not just in that, in the general Jewish community, we still have work to do. But are you, I guess my question is, are you optimistic that eventually, whether you speak or understand Yiddish or not, or your ancestors did, is just not going to make a difference anymore?
I mean, you get really to the heart of the question, which is really a forward-looking question,
Yes.
because I think I agree with you that while we don't use the language of race science, or it's not explicitly articulated using racist language, the way of thinking about who Jews are and who Jews should be and which Jewish stories are the center of the story and which are on the margins is just so obvious in American society that it's been taken for granted. It's been so internalized. Think about any domain. Think about food. Think about humor. Think about the image of where the families come from, the clothing, the music, the language. I'm talking about popularly, it's all essentially Eastern European, right? What is Jewish food? What comes to mind? It's not borekas or kibbeh or something like that, you know?
To me, it is.
No, I know to you it is. And to me, I mean, I have both, but to me, but to the American population, I'm doing a little, my brother is a filmmaker, and we started doing a little exploration of American film. And we found that there are over 4,000 American films that talk about Jews. We found only just over a dozen films that use the word Sephardic. And all of them, almost all of them, are used when there is a figure who is not white in a Jewish space. And the comment is, oh, you must be Sephardic. And it's, oh, that's the joke. There's only one joke. That's the only line. There's nothing else to say about Sephardic history, about Sephardic culture, about Sephardic experience, and all of its multiplicities. It doesn't exist in the American consciousness. And that general consciousness, I would say, is refracted in the academy, in the way in which we study and teach about Jewish history. So in some ways, we haven't moved very beyond, Salo Baron that you mentioned, who wrote, 100 years ago or so. Right now, I would say that in terms of progress, we are seeing what I would say the footnote or agglutinative stage in Jewish history, which is that now somebody has told them once that there are other Jews that exist in the world and that it is not okay anymore to completely cut them out of the story. So I get a lot of requests for people saying, I have 7 minutes in one lesson that I'm giving in my 20 lectures about Jewish history, and I want to use 7 minutes to talk about all of the non-Ashkenazi Jews. And I want to talk about the Jews from Curacao, and I want to talk about the Jews from the Ottoman Empire, and I want to talk about the Jews who speak Arabic, and I want to talk about the Jews from Bombay, India, in 7 minutes. Can you give me, Professor Naar, can you give me one source that I could give my students for my 7 minutes? Like, I'm exaggerating, but I'm not really exaggerating, insofar as we're in a phase in which people, especially I think because of the context now of what is happening in terms of discussions about inequity and diversity and racial justice, there is now some greater sensitivity, and you're going to learn more about it, I think, next week with Michal about the issue of Jews of color. But I think right now, generally we're at this kind of appendix phase. So I'm doing my course on Jewish history. Like, let's have one, I'm going to do one thing. So we might also call it the tokenizing phase, right? So say, you exist.
That's better than not having anything, isn't it?
Well, I think so. As long as what my fear is that some people will say, but look, I did it. What do I need to do anymore? I had my 7 minutes. right? Talked about all the other Jews in the world. And so what I think needs to happen in this, as in other disciplines, this is not specific to Jewish studies or Jewish history. What needs to happen is rethinking the way that we tell the story of Jews more generally in all disciplines, in a way to think about how can Jews from non-say European backgrounds, from Muslim contexts, from other contexts, how do their stories change how we tell the story of Jewish history? The problem with that is it requires a lot more work and it requires a lot more effort, because we now have 200 years of professional Jewish history telling the story with white European Ashkenazi Jews at the center of the story. And in order to free up some space, not only to make room for other Jews, but to see how do these other Jews ask us to tell a different story, to ask new questions about the Jewish experience, new questions about race, new questions about migration, new questions about empire and nationalism. Like, the whole story will change. And I think that that is scary for some of our colleagues who have built their careers on writing history a different way, which imagines Europe as the center, which imagines whiteness at the center. That all has to be decentered and destabilized in order to really make room in an equitable way and integrate the experiences of other Jews and transform our understanding of who Jews are in the world and their relationships to other peoples.
I mean, I feel on that last point that you made, much of the responsibility lies on people such as you and me, because and some other people in this room today. No, meaning that, look, the way that Jewish history is taught today in universities, but also in, let's say, Jewish high schools, is affected by that field that you mentioned, the 200 years or close to 200 years of this history that has been written. The fact is that we are now, I don't know if the tokenizing is so good. I'm with you, I'm not sure about that, but we are in a phase where at the very least we do get a lot more questions. I do, you do, many others do. And there is a lot more interest. In other words, some people are beginning to understand, wait a minute, our story is not really complete and we haven't been doing it right. Now, part of our responsibility in our institutions, but also to advocate for other institutions, is to look at this and say, look, it starts with basic things like when we teach a Jewish history survey, it can't be, modern Jewish history can't be Ashkenazi history. It can be also Ashkenazi history. And we have work to do in our program. We have some work to do, and I'm sure most other programs have work to do. And once we do that, perhaps one of the things that would happen is that those things would trickle down into others who'd be using them. We could create more resources. So when people say, give me one document, I don't know how, you didn't say how you respond to that question. Usually I respond to it by, there is no one document, you need to do more. And I don't know if anyone appreciates that kind of response. But I think that we have some work to do in the sense that if you look at, really any part of the history that we tell, even if we look at violence against Jews, right? So there's this assumption that there was no violence against Jews in the Middle East. And the story is always about pogroms and anti-Semitism in Russia and Eastern Europe. And that story should be told. But there are a lot more people who've studied Jewish history who have heard about these disturbances and massacres of Jews in Europe from the 19th century all the way leading up to the Holocaust, but have never heard of the 1840 Damascus affair, for instance, or the Farhud in Iraq in the 1940s. And I know from my students, I could have a class, half the students are Jewish. They've heard of all these things just from, their Jewish day schools or whatnot. They've heard of all these things that happened in Europe. If I say the word Farhud, they have no clue what I'm talking about, because no one has ever told them about that. So I just think there's work for us to be done, and it can be done. And then the question is, can we take an example from what's happening, for instance, in Israel? And that's a question I had, but also we received that as one of the questions in the chat. So I'll combine the two into this. in Israel, in fact, there have been, in terms of this cultural integration and considering everyone Jewish, perhaps some more steps have already been taken to do that than here in the United States. Because there's a growing number of people in Israel who are mixed. It wasn't very common back in the 1970s. I know that there's a story my mom keeps repeating to me every now and then about this guy she used to date before she dated my father, and they almost got married. And then his parents were like, "Oh, you're not marrying this Arab woman. That's not going to happen." So it all fell apart. And then she met my father, who is also Ashkenazi, but his family didn't mind. I think those things are less and less common today. And if anything, because there's a greater share of Israeli society that just doesn't care about that stuff, that is mixed, that sees, even you talked about food, right? So, here there's assumption that gefilte fish is Jewish food, but, in Israel, it's just one of the Jewish foods, right? There's so much other stuff that's happening. And it's not unusual for Ashkenazi Israelis to eat spicy food and enjoy it, whereas here that they might complain about it a little bit. My point is, can we look at what happened in Israel? And by no means I'm implying that Israeli Jewish society is an anti-racist society. We know that's not the case, but can we look at that example and maybe be inspired by it, or say, okay, well, there are things that can happen. It can be done. You can create a Jewish society that accepts everyone.
It's a great question. I mean, I think you're right in terms of your assessment of how things work in Israel. I think part of it is demographic. In Israel, half or maybe more of Israeli Jews are of, Mizrahi, North African or Middle Eastern background. And so there are the numbers there that really play a very prominent role in, I think, shaping those conversations in a certain way. Like if you literally cut out half your population from the history book, which actually was the case, in the past. I mean, the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East are not really represented in even Israeli history books until quite recently.
Not yet.
Yeah, but so there, it's still not happening on an official level, and that has to do with power. The power that this population has, which is much reduced compared to the Ashkenazi Jews who retain a lot of political power in the country. But I think in America, if we're talking about, what is the population of American Jews that are of non-Ashkenazi background is quite small. I mean, maybe 15, 20% of American Jews are of, and it's unclear how they count, Jews of color or Jews of non-European, non-Ashkenazi background. So there is a significant number there, but it's not the same. And the communities are not necessarily organized in the same way. So I would be hopeful. I would love to see, I think it's going to have to, I would love to see some of the transformations that you are describing that has happened in Israel. Like, I think intermarriage between Sephardim and Ashkenazi Jews, at least of certain kinds, that, by World War II, that those barriers were broken down in the American context. I think a lot of people, I've heard, this is anecdotal, but a lot of people say, well, at least, better marry a Jew than a not, maybe you've heard this before. It's better to marry a Jew than, somebody who's not Jewish at all. This is a common refrain that I've heard. And I think that has also contributed to that kind of embrace of a wide variety of Jewish kinds of people in families. But I don't think that yet has transferred into public representation. Like, can you believe that there's been one movie in the history of American cinema about a Sephardic Jewish character, which is a very not well-known Tom Hanks movie, actually, called Every Time I Say Goodbye or something like that. You should check it out. But like, of all the film, like, that's the one representation. I remember identifying with Aladdin as a kid because I was like, that's the closest that I'm going to ever come to like feeling like there's like somebody who's like me on the big screen. I think that the same thing happens with institutions. Where is the institutional transformation going to come from? In the Hebrew schools, in the Jewish schools. the Reform movement, the conservative movement, the Orthodox movement, the Reconstructionist movement. I think there's some progress being made, but it will require the institutions, the Jewish federations of the world, the Jewish press of the world, right? You can have conferences now that are about Jewish newspapers. What do they mean by Jewish newspapers? I mean Yiddish newspapers. You have a book about Jewish names. What do they mean about Jewish names? They mean Ashkenazi names. You can have a thing about whatever you want, Jewish humor, courses on Jewish humor. It's Woody Allen from the the Borscht Belt to Woody Allen, and that's Jewish humor. Nobody wants to talk about, by the way, how Seinfeld's mother is of Ottoman Syrian Jewish origin. Maybe there's a really strong influence of Syrian Jewish humor in American Jewish humor, and we just didn't know it because nobody's willing to talk about these kind of closed off stories in our narrative, because we have really what we have a failing of is we have a lack of imagination, I would say. It's hard to imagine beyond the contours of what we are familiar with. And I think once we do that, we can open up the story and it will enrich the Jewish experience. I don't want to displace, like you said, Ashkenazi history. I'm not interested in that. Doesn't make any sense. But to enrich it, to expand it, to see how the stories interact and how they might change and how we might all be better off because of it.
Right. Well, we are coming close to the hour time that we had, but I do want to ask you one last question, and that's about maybe nuancing this conversation. And it comes from a few questions that I've seen in the chat, and I apologize, in the last 5 minutes, I've received like 20 questions. So this is all fascinating, and I'm feel free to contact me by email, and I'm happy to discuss it with any of you. But I'll just say, if I can combine a few of those questions. It's more than just Ashkenazi versus Sephardic Jews, right? Because first of all, a lot of this Yiddish thing and focus on Yiddish and all that, it comes and culture and Eastern European Judaism, it really comes from the dominance of parts of the Ashkenazi world in American Jewry, let's say people from New York, for instance, or in Jewish studies as a field. We know that there are other communities, for instance, Jews have been here for let's say for 5, 6, 7, or 10 generations who are Ashkenazi and who've lived in the South or in other parts of the country, may not necessarily expect you to speak Yiddish because the culture is different. And there's also the issue of, it's not just about Sephardic Jews, right? It's also about other Jews who came from non-European places. We have a very large Persian Jewish community in California, for example, right? And so I guess some of these questions may sort of venture out of our main topic, but is there a place that we can nuance this a little bit, even for the sake of maybe being a little more optimistic about what can be done, meaning maybe the problem is not as severe if we look at particular details. I don't know. Maybe it's me trying to be optimistic.
Well, I would like to be optimistic. I would. And I mean, I think that things are changing. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation, for example, or, and the way in which people are interested in what you and I have to say in both our research in terms of public kinds of conversation, these are all really good signs. And I take them to be very, very positive, and they're steps in the right direction. What it does, though, is it places the burden, you already alluded to this, on sort of a few. And so it's kind of like, so who's starting this conversation? And this is the same kind of question that you can see in other spaces when it comes to equity and representation. Do the people who are advocating for those who are underrepresented, do they always have to be the ones there saying, and please consider us in terms of how you're framing your conversation? Because when you consider these other stories, Persian Jewish story, the Ottoman Jewish story, whatever the Iraqi story, I mean, there's many different kinds of stories. It's not a zero-sum game. And it's not like, you have to include this and then, the whole artifice, the whole foundation of what you've been doing until now has to become undone. but it does mean that there may be some transformations that do need to take place. And I'd really like to see some of the major institutions in the American Jewish community, academically and otherwise, take this up. I mean, they're doing it now in terms of like racial equity. But in some ways, there's a parallel and kind of interrelated conversation that in your boards and in your curriculum of your Jewish organization, you'd like to have a wide representation of, white Jews and Jews of color and Black Jews, but also thinking about the different kinds of traditions that people of different backgrounds might be able to bring to that conversation can also be really enriching. And I think for me that is kind of a point that I hope people will acknowledge, that the Jewish experience gains greater texture. It gains more vivacity. It gains more nuance and complexity when we're able to bring those other kinds of stories into the picture. And I hope that will be the case. And I hope that there will be moves made in that direction, not only among people like you and me, Yaron, but also among people who are really, in some ways, the gatekeepers of American Jewish life, and could, with the investment of funds, develop new curriculums, or training programs. Like, there's nowhere to become a Sephardic rabbi in the United States. Did you know that? There's nowhere even to learn really about Sephardic customs and Sephardic practices in an established rabbinical school in the United States.
No, and many Sephardic synagogues, if they're not ultra-Orthodox, if they're more liberal or just less religious, they end up hiring Ashkenazi rabbis because they can't. There are very few, as you said, who are Sephardic and trained as Sephardic rabbis. It's just not something you can find.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's a whole other conversation about,
right.
Liberal Judaism and Sephardic Judaism and how they can and cannot jive. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, lots of open questions, and I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been great, and hopefully, just the beginning of many other conversations that need to happen. I also want again to apologize for the many questions that we got and we didn't get to address. Some of them are great questions, but somewhat fall out of either today's topic or really our expertise, unless, Devin, you developed a new expertise on Black Jews, for instance, recently.
Well, it's something that I'm looking at because it's part of because a lot of the tensions that I describe are based on anti-Black attitudes.
That's right.
But yeah.
Well, anyways,
I'd love to see the question. If you don't, sorry, no, I mean, if you don't mind sharing the questions with me later on, I mean, I'd love to.
Yes.
I'd love to take a look. I received also some private chats with some really great questions too that we weren't able to get to. So sorry about that. But,
we will hopefully have more chances. This is a good topic, and the fact that it raises all of these questions is also encouraging. It's encouraging, and I think that this is what it tells us, is that the conversation is just beginning, and it's going to continue on all sorts of levels in our community, with community events, in our here at the Jewish Studies program, with courses that we offer, and there's a lot more that's going to happen. So I encourage all of you to check out what we do and stick with us, and good thing will happen. And in the meanwhile, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And thank you once again, Devin, for joining us. And that's it. I wish you all a happy Sunday or remainder of the weekend.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And hopefully next time in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, definitely.
Bye-bye.